In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, I hope you are doing well. Today, I'm here with a book calling Psycholinguistics. As you know, we talk about psycholinguistics previously, and you know that the book, again I want to tell you the name of the writers. There is a book which is called Psycholinguistics, written by H. Wind Coles, PhD, and it has been published in Springer Publishing Company in New York. In this book, we will discuss about what is psycholinguistics in a chapter 1, and in the next chapter we will talk about language as an object of psychological study. In chapter 3 we are dealing with how we know what we know. Method in psycholinguistics will be discussed. In chapter 4, information flow and language ambiguity will be discussed. Chapter 5, multiple language representation and the brain. And also in chapter 6, the writer is talking about language in a real world, dialect and conference. Chapter 7, using your hands or sign language. And in chapter 8, we are dealing with how good is good enough. These are the main title of the book. But as you know, we want to start our teaching with the topic, what is psycholinguistics? Do you know how you are able to read this sentence? Language serves a central role in our daily lives. Be it talking about complex thought and ideas, ordering lunch, reading a magazine, or persuading someone to do a favor. It's hard to, in fact, imagine going through an entire day without using it, without reading, without producing or understanding single words, picture for a moment what it would be like if you need to get a ride from a friend to airport next Saturday, but could not use language in any form to communicate. How would you ask? How would you know that your friend understand and would give you a ride at the right time or not? For that matter, how would you have, in fact, booked your flight in the first place? Language is everywhere in human society, across every culture. For most people, it's an effortless ability that we acquire before we learn how to dress ourselves. It means when we are so young, we are not able to dress, we are able to speak. And before anything else, we try to learn language. Some people feel that they even think using language that an important part of their thoughts involving kind of internal monologue, and they think that the language is not simple thing. And those people who who believe that their thinking is a kind of talking to ourselves, somehow consider language as a simple things, but we know that language is not a simple thing. It's actually quite complex, and we need to be able to use it quickly. In fact, its timing is so crucial that even minor delay during the processing of language are thought to have profound consequences. So, by understanding how language works and how we are able to use it, we can understand a vital, complex part of our daily lives, offer ideas for how to help people with language disorders, and perhaps even shed light on how we think. All of these aspects are very important. Now I want to state such a question. What is a psycholinguist? As the name suggests, it's someone, psycholinguist is a person, someone who studies phenomenon in the intersections of linguistics and psychology. But this doesn't really answer the question. It pushes back. So first, what is linguist? What is linguistics? The first questions may be this: what is linguistics? It's the science of studying language, or in fact, it's a scientific study of language. And what is psychology? The second questions may rise. What is psychology? The scientific, I could answer this question in this way, that a scientific study of human behavior and cognition is that how we think is called psychology. So psychology is dealing with human behavior and cognition, human thought. The union of these two fields is principally concerned with the processing and knowledge representations that underlie the ability to use language and how they relate to other aspects of human cognition. In short, psycholinguistics ask the question, how it's that people are able moment by moment to produce and understand language. How it's possible to produce and understand a language, and by extension, how do children come to have this ability? This is the next topic and the field of interest in psycholinguistics. And the third one is how and why it is sometimes impaired after the brain damage. When somebody's or someone's brain will damage, what will happen and why the language will be affected? All of these are the main questions or the main concerns of the psycholinguistics fields. The term psycholinguistics is a little bit misleading in that it minimizes the contribution of about a half dozen other fields of scientific research. To truly get to the bottom of how language works, we need expertise not only from linguistics and psychology, but also from other scientific fields such as neuroscience and computer science. The whole endeavor of psycholinguistics often find, in fact, a home in a broader research field of cognitive science, an interdisciplinary field that addresses the difficult questions of how animals, people, and even computers think. You know that this is a very difficult question, but the whole, in fact, endeavor of psycholinguistics often find itself in the field of cognitive science. Why the need for, at least for research, failed to understand some things as simply trivial as language, some things that most people have pretty much mastered before they turn full. As I mentioned earlier, language is more complicated than it might first appear. At a first glance, it may seem somehow simple, but it's not as simple as you think, and it is more complicated than it might first appear. And so it's very easy views that makes it so interesting. Let's start. Since we use the language so simply, we think that language itself is simple, but it's not the case. Now I want to say, let's start with an analogy. For instance, walking around is also pretty easy for most people, and it is something that we usually learn to do even before we learn how to talk. But can you explain exactly how it works? How each muscles, bones, and tendon all allows us to defy gravity at every step? It's easy to do. You can walk easily, but it's hard for a layman to explain how it works. Got it? Instead, it takes an army of biologists, physiologists, and others to explain these easy skills. It's easy skills, but must be explained. Language is the same. Language is very much the same. Its function is easy to master when you are young. Language is a very fundamental things. Things that any newborn babies after 3 years will be mastered in his or her parental language or mother tongue. So although it seems somehow easy, or in fact everyone could do it, but it's somehow difficult to explain or hard for us to explain it. And like walking, for instance, we have a lot of gain by understanding it. The centrality of language in our daily lives means that any disruptions to our ability to use it may be keenly felt. The worse the disruptions, the more devastating its impact. Sorry. I'm sorry, I want to turn off the phone. And also, I've told you that why the need for, at least for research, will understand something simply trivial as language. We discuss about it. The centrality, yes, I was here. The centrality of language in our daily lives means that any disruption of our ability to use it may keenly felt. The worse the disruptions, the more devastating the impact. So these disruptions can come as a part of aging, for example. It can come from developmental problem, and it can come from damage to the brain. or any other, body system that impact our ability to perceive or produce language, such as damage, for instance, to our hearing. Anyway, in all of these cases, the disruptions may be relatively small. Something happens and the ability have been disrupted. But these disruptions may be relatively somehow small. Perhaps difficulty in finding the right word, for instance, or understanding very complex and unusual language. They are somehow normal, and all of us may experience such cases in our life. But it can also be quite severe. When these disruptions are small, you must not, in fact, be worried about it at all. But these disruptions can be quite severe, from a complete loss of nearly all language to a particularly difficult or a difficulty, for example, in productions or understanding even fairly simple sentences. Okay? Anyway, of course, research on how this breakdown occur can help us better understand how to help restore language function. But even research on how language processing works in a fully functioning systems is very important. Why? Because it can provide us with a model of language processing that can then be used to develop more effective therapies for people with disruptions to their language ability. Knowing, or in fact exploring language processing will help us to, again, in return, will help the people who have a breakdown in language in order to recover their ability, or we can use the best therapies in order to help them obtain their own language ability again. One of the key challenge for processing a language is that it comes from, in fact, at people fast. While speaking rates differ somewhat among speakers and languages, on average, people have to deal with around 2 or 3 words per second. In any kind of language, we can say on average, people have to deal with around 2 or just 3 words per second. That's roughly 5 or 6, for example, syllables, or 25 to 30 individual sounds per second. Perhaps this is not striking to you. Clearly, it's easy because everyone can do it. So, how is this a challenge? To convince yourself, go right now to a computer and visit a website, for example. For instance, go to BBC World Service, and that plays, for example, audio broadcast in language from all over the world. In this service, pick a language that is unfamiliar to you. Okay, you can pick it and listen to some of the broadcast in it. Of course, it's not going to have meaning for you, but let's set that aside for a moment. Focus instead on the sound of language. This is for an unknown language, but you want to just focus on the sound of that language. Can you make out the individual sounds? Can you recognize the individual sounds of that unknown language? Probably you can catch some of them. But could you write down each sound? that you hear? Is it possible for you to write down? Can you tell where all the word breaks or? Probably not, because you are not mastering that language. So we can say language is easy when you are a native or a fluent speaker of it. But if you do not know the language, it's hard to even catch all the sounds in this level. The language can be difficult. Clearly, there is something critical to being a speaker of a language that allows very rapid information processing. If you are a native speaker of any kind of language, you have a rapid processing of informations. Otherwise, for unknown language, it will not happen. Let's turn back to a language you do know. For example, you are the speakers of Arabic language. If we turn back to a language you do know, for instance, English, here we are talking about English since you and I, all of us are acquainted with English. And think about all that's involved in successfully understanding just a single sentence. We can use the following sentence in one as an example. For instance, number 1, you called Frank about the computer yesterday. You called Frank about the computer yesterday. It's a question. Suppose you hear these questions rather than reading it. Just you are hearing this sentence. Let's start at the most basic steps and work up. First, you need to be able to make out the sounds that you hear. First of all, you have to make out the sounds that you hear and break them up into words. Next, you need to be able to assign meaning to those words. Okay? For example, you need to know who said the sentence and to whom they said it. In order to know who the you and the Frank are, you need to know what a computer is, and so on. Next, you need to know who did what. In this case, who did the calling. There is also information about when this event happened and some extra information about the topic of the event. It involves a computer in some ways. And next, the intonation of a sentence. Mark in writing with a question mark tells us, and by changing in pitch and tone of sound and intonations, tells us that this is a question, not a statement. And this is finally leads to the fact that to fully understand a sentence, we must link it to our wide understanding of the word and the intention of the speaker. The speaker may be looking for confirmation about some things he or she can't quite remember. Can we provide it? So this also means knowing what it was about a computer that would prompt a call to someone named Frank. In the rest of these chapters, in the rest of this lecture, we will examine many of the research findings from psycholinguistics that tells us some things about how these steps works and more. First, however, in this chapter, in this unit, we will start with a brief history of the field to situate the current states of origins, and then we will discuss some of the overarching issues that frame much of the research. And finally, we will cover a brief review of the rest of the chapter in this book. Okay, let's start with a brief history of psycholinguistics. We want to know what happened for psycholinguistics from so many times ago till now. interest in the mind and language, both two topics. We have two topics, mind and language. Interest in these two topics both date back to the dates back to in fact a person with a documentary history of language studying refer back to 2,500 years and spread across many cultures, including, for example, in India, China, Greece, or anywhere else. Documented interest in the mind and knowledge, it means the foundations of how we consider to be a psychology, also dates back in one form or another at least as early as language study, and perhaps earlier than it. However, a modern version of both linguistics and psychology are much more recent, with modern psychology tracing back to Wilhelm Wadnett's Leipzig in the late 18th. Wilhelm's. The psychology study refer back to or tracing back to Wilhelm in late 80s. In modern linguistics, tracing back to roughly the same time, again 80s. Both fields, both linguistics and psychology, have undergone some revolution in even that relatively short time, with both fields experiencing some major shift in the mid-19th that are still felt today, and we follow that shift in the interest of the psychology and linguistics. From the beginning of the psychology, there has been an interest in language too. Wilhelm, for example, published a book on language in 1900. This book, with about 1,400 pages by 1913 editions, cover a number of topics that are still very, very, very much relevant in current psycholinguistics, including child language acquisition, sign language, language perceptions, and grammatical structures. The interest between the domain of language and psychology was mutual and discussed by, for example, Blumenthal in 1987. We believe that many linguists of the day were also interested in Wundt's works and attended his lecture at the University of Leipzig, including several influential language research such as Leonard Bloomfield, Ferdinand de Saussure, and Edward Boas. For example, Bloomfield's approach to analyzing structure of language is important to almost all modern theories of grammar. As you know, this is a very outstanding work of Leonard Bloomfield. Yes. Besides, we have Ferdinand de Saussure made a critical distinctions that is still a part of how language researchers think about language. For example, lango, which is based on the theories of Bloomfield, lango, which is knowledge of a language system that exists collectively among a speaker of a language. This is called lango. But beside these terms, he introduced another term, parallel, which is the use of that systems. Parallel is the use of that systems. As you know, lango is the knowledge of language system. It exists collectively among the speakers. It exists in a mind. It's abstract. But parallel, which is the use of that systems, it means that systems in context. It's somehow more concrete comparing to, in fact, language. All these two terms first introduced by Ferdinand de Saussure. While Wandent was an experimentalist, in fact, famously so, is considered by many to be the father of modern experimental psychology. We have different branches in psychology. One of them is experimental psychology. Wundt was an experimentalist. He also acknowledged the importance of internal mental states and viewed language as importantly reflecting mental representations. He viewed the sentence as a key unit of language. The sentence as a key unit of language, and thought that show how universal characteristics of human information processing, for example, like attention and memory, would influence its production on and also the comprehension of the language. It's really his note so different from what modern psycholinguistic researchers are doing, though the route from Wundt's experiments to the present day is not entirely direct. Wundt was not the only researcher at the time who was interested in language, of course, and in fact there was some conflicts between Wundt's approach and others, including approaches that disagree with the idea of unified mental representations and the other types of introspective approaches, a different approach which were popular in that age. In fact, at the turn of the century, there were quite a number of competing perspectives on psychology, which led one linguist of a day, Bernard de Barck, to suggest that linguists might do better to part away with psychology. This is largely what happened, and for the next 30 or 40 years, linguists focused instead on a formal aspect of language. For example, they focused on a sound system, grammatical structure, word formation rules, without much reference to a mental processing needed for their actual use. This approach still forms a core aspect of linguistic study today. Next, I want to talk about the trouble that there are a number of aspects of language that cannot be explained by classical or operational conditioning. In a famous critique of Skinner's book, Noam Chomsky successfully argued against a verbal behaviorism with several key options. Crucially, as we shall see in Chapter 2, language is recursive and can produce an infinite number of sentences from a finite set of systemic rules and representation. We have a finite set, but you can produce infinite set. The complexities of language that these rules create are, in fact, difficult, if not impossible, to account for a simple stimulus and response terms. As a part of argument, Chomsky reintroduced the idea of mental representation back to the study of language. He also drew an important distinction between the knowledge of the one, in fact, the knowledge that any person or somebody has about the language, who call it competence, and the use of that language we call performance. As you know, and we have mentioned before, these two distinctions is somehow similar to the distinctions of language apparel drawn by Ferdinand de Saussure roughly of 60 years earlier. Chomsky's influence on modern linguistics and psycholinguistics is very, very deep and profound, and his focus on competence as opposed to performance drew linguistics heavily in these directions. On the other hand, psychology continued to be quite interested in concept of language performance. Nevertheless, several of Chomsky's proposals about the nature of syntactic structure, and in the particular his work on transformational grammar, prompted experimentations by psychologists in 1960s to see whether the linguistic process proposed were psychological process. For example, let's consider one could reasonably ask whether structures that were proposed to be more complex linguistically would cause longer processing times. The results were mixed. Research shows that there was an important, in fact, relationship between linguistic structure on one hand and psychological processing on the other hand, but didn't support the particular relationship proposed by transformational grammar, despite initial success that they have achieved. Also, it became interestingly clear that these distinctions between competence and performance was not trivial, and that the competence theories proposed by linguists could not simply be transferred to the performance because they are very different from each other. Although they are similar, but they have so many differences too. Another difficulty was that linguistic theory were changing rapidly, and that made it more difficult for psychologists to test them. And as a result, there was relatively little interaction between the study of psychology and linguistics, at least for the next couple of decades. Psychologists were still interested in language, very much so, but focused more on issues of performance. Psychologists were focused on performance, such as the process by which syntactic structures are constructed in real time, how ambiguities in language are resolved, and how word knowledge is accessed upon encountering a word. Linguists were still interested in language as a mental phenomenon. Linguist was in favor of mentalism, it's a mental phenomenon, but focused on issue of competence. Focused on competence. What knowledge of a language entails, and formulating theories that could apply to all languages. They were looking for creating a model and also, formulating theories, different theories for language faculty which apply to all languages regardless of the apparent differences among them. They were searching for a universal grammar. But the separation between these two fields, psychology on one side and linguistics on the other side, was not too last. Starting in the last 1980 and early 1990, there was a renewed interest in psycholinguistics, which is a joint, venture between the linguistics and psychologists. And these days, many researchers have been trained in both disciplines as well as the other, field. Substantial advances, for example, in related disciplines, including neuroscience, computer science, cognitive science, have given research interested in language processing as a huge new set of resources, both in terms of knowledge and tools. We now have researchers working on computational model of language processing informed by current knowledge about how the brain works. We have researchers, on the other hand, working at intersection of language and other cognitive abilities, including not just working memory, but things like scene perception and reasoning. It's actually a very exciting time to be in fact, psycholinguist, both because of this explosion of new interdisciplinary endeavor and because prior work has meant that we have started to build to solid foundations of understanding about how language processing works. There are several key issues or themes that we should be aware of when thinking about how people processing language. These are actually not limited to language, just language processing, but they are related to more broadly about how and when information is processed. And as such, they have shaped the major approaches and, in fact, theories within psycholinguistics. We will discuss each of the most relevant themes in the next session. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for your attention. It's enough for this session. And if you have studied this part and there was any questions, let me know your questions via email or discussion in your group chat or whether in our online classes if you were able to attend in our online classes. Anyway, have a nice time and goodbye.